right, we're recording now, and I want to welcome everybody. Tonight we're going to be just looking at Passover because that'll be coming up on the 22nd, and so we're going to talk about Passover tonight, and then the following Sunday, next Sunday night, we'll be talking a little bit more about Yeshua in the Passover, some of the prophetic scriptures, and then also we'll revisit like we did last year, because there's so many of them that were not on with us last year. We'll look at the the timeline of when the Passover, how the Passover took place. So we'll be looking at that next week. But today we're going to. I'm still using some of the pictures that I had from last year, but just because I thought they were cool. They're nice pictures, and I'm a picture kind of guy. So the story that we're going to go into, of course, the Exodus. We need a little bit of background to set the stage for one of the most momentous occasions in human history. So let's look at this. There we go. So how did we get to Egypt anyway? So as you know, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and through he worked for Potiphar. Potiphar's wife took a shine to him, and he was having none of it. And so anyway, he ended up in prison. You know the story, how it just seemed like God blessed him everywhere he went. Even in prison, he was blessed, and even though he stayed there a good long time, but he got out, and where the baker and the Pharaoh's baker and his wine steward, both of them were thrown into prison, and they had dreams, and Joseph interpreted the dreams, and they were correct. The baker was executed. The wine steward was not. He was promoted back to his position, and then he still stayed in prison for a while until Pharaoh had a dream, and it troubled him. And so his wine taster guy said, you know what, I remember when I was in prison that there was a Hebrew that could interpret dreams. And so they bring him out of prison, and he interprets the dream for Pharaoh, and so Pharaoh said, anybody that can interpret this dream that well, we're just going to make him in charge of all of this. So, you remember the dream. He had 7 cows that they were fat cows, and then here came the 7 skinny cows, and the skinny cows ate up the fat cows. And then he had 7 ears of corn that were big and fat, and then the 7 skinny ears of corn came up and ate up the fat ears. Now, I didn't know ears of corn could eat other ears of corn, but anyway, they did all that.
He had pizza the night before.
So, Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of gathering food for 7 years, because the dreams meant that there would be 7 years of famine, and then 7 years of plenty, and then 7 years of famine that they had to prepare for. So Joseph set about doing all of that, and setting aside food, and so during the 7 good years, they stored food all over Egypt in vast storehouses. And then the famine set in, and we know then how the story went with that it got more severe and more severe, and it even touched over in Canaan, where Israel and his family were living. And so that he sent his sons, 10 of the sons, down to Egypt to buy grain so that they could survive. And so I'm doing this the Cliff's Note version, so that basically what had happened is they did that. Joseph saw them. He recognized them, and through a couple of trips there, he got his whole family to move to Egypt, and that's how they got there. Well, they did very well for about 400 years in Egypt. They lived in the land of Goshen, and which is a very lush delta region of the Nile, and but then the Bible says that then along came a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and so he had big ambitions, and he was also not this new Pharaoh was not of the same line as the old one. The old ones were the Hyksos pharaohs, and they were Semites actually, and they were called the shepherd kings, and they looked favorably upon the Hebrews, but this new Pharaoh was not, and they looked with disfavor on shepherds. And so anyway, because of his ambitions to build and do and be powerful, he enslaved the Israelites because they had grown so many. There were a couple of million by that time. And if you remember during the famine that had gone on 400 years before, the people had sold everything that they had to the government to buy grain, and finally there was nothing left to sell except for themselves, so they sold themselves into bondage to the government of Egypt. So basically everyone in Egypt were bondsmen or bond slaves to the government, kind of like Americans today in our income tax that we've got. That's how we got to Egypt, and that's that Pharaoh was very cruel, and he oppressed the Israelites, and they cried out to the Lord, and God heard their cries. So what happens? God calls Moses, and that's a great story in itself. During this time, Pharaoh was so concerned that there were going to be so many the Hebrews that they may join up with his enemies and help to defeat him. So he said, well, we're going to kill all the male babies. So they had a genocide there of killing all the male babies. Well, there was a couple of parents that decided that they're going to hide their baby, and so they did for about 3 months. They could no longer do it, so she put him in a basket and put him in the river, and he floated down the river. And of course, that was Moses. So any of you that ever feel like that you can't do anything and that you're worthless, just remember Moses started out as a basket case. His mother put him in the basket. It floats down the river and ends up being discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter. Lo and behold, Moses grows up in the Pharaoh's household. He becomes a very highly educated man, and he was a military person. There's stories that said that he invaded and conquered the army in Ethiopia. He did other things, but he was very well educated in the household of Pharaoh. But then he knew of his Hebrew heritage, and one day he sees an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian. And so even though he grew up in the Pharaoh's house, that was a no-no. So he had to flee to Midian, and he was in Midian for 40 years, and then God called him back. We know the story of the burning bush, where God spoke to him from the burning bush, and he told him to go back to Egypt, and that he was going to free. Be the instrument to free God's people from the tyranny and the slavery of Egypt. And I related in my sermon yesterday about how Moses, when he kind of questioned God gave him 2 signs. One of them was he turned his staff into a snake, and then the other thing was that he told told Moses to stick his hand down in his in his cloak, pull it out, and he pulled it out, and it was it had sarat, which has been translated leprosy, but we know it wasn't what we consider leprosy today. It's called sarat. It's a skin disease, but he says his hand was white. And then he said, put your hand back in your cloak, and he did, and he pulled it out again, and it was healed. So this was a sign that God was showing Moses that, look, I can do anything. And so anyway, that is where we pick up with the story of Moses, and he he had been tending the sheep for his father-in-law, and the burning bush was out there, and God just spoke to him from there. And so that started the signs and wonders that Moses saw for the next 40 years. Now, Moses was kind of a reluctant leader. He tried to convince God that he wasn't the proper candidate, that he was not a good speaker, and but in the end, he did listen to the Lord, and the Bible says that there was never a prophet before him like Moses, nor after. And so, and I mentioned that it's always incredible to me that this guy Moses, who grew up in the Pharaoh's household, then because of crime he was exiled, and he had to flee anyway, and then he comes back after 40 years with a different Pharaoh, but still, I mean, it's the same government, same laws and everything, and he's given he has access to the mightiest ruler in the world at that time, and here he was, the leader of the ragtag slaves. Now, how did he get access to the Pharaoh like that? And that in itself is pretty incredible to me. So, then the story, we know that Moses and Aaron had demanded that Pharaoh release the Hebrews, the Israelites, but they were rebuffed over and over again, and then God sent a series of plagues on the Egyptians. And each one of those plagues was a direct affront to the gods of Egypt. Now, I listed these things. We're just going to go through them fairly quickly, because it's really not other than the fact that these were the major deities of Egypt. What God was doing was showing the Egyptians that everything that he did was, it was against their gods. He was knocking down each one of their gods. So before we get to that, I did want to post this timeline, the Exodus timeline. What it does, it talks about when Abraham was born, and goes down through the genealogy of Abraham and so forth, and it lines up with who the pharaohs were at the time, and like I said, the Hyksos kings of Egypt had started ruling, and so anyway, once the Hyksos group were expelled, then Moses was born, and we had a different set of rulers then. And so this just gives you a timeline. You can pull this up later, and I'll have it posted. But it gives you some very interesting, the timing and so forth, on down to when the northern kingdoms were carried away into captivity. So kind of shows you how things were in the order of how they occurred. So now the pictures that they had. These are the pictures that they found in some of the ruins and the pyramids and the graves and so forth of the Egyptians. And so it shows some of their gods and goddesses. And these guys, this Apis and Isis, were the god and the goddess of the Nile. And of course, the Nile was the most important physical feature of Egypt, because every year it would overflood the banks, and then it would flood the soil with nutrients, and they could go in there behind that and plant their crops. And that's how Egypt had been progressing, and how they've been so prosperous for many, many years. So these were their gods. So what did God do? He started to attack and just destroy each one of these deities of the Egyptians. And first, he had the plague of frogs, and of course the frogs were important to the economy of Egypt also, because the frogs ate a lot of the insects that would come up with the flooding of the land, and so there were frogs everywhere, and but they were in check. Well, God increased the amount of the frogs to the point where they were everywhere, just all over everything, and just you couldn't walk without squishing a frog. And so that was just nasty. And again, their frog was one of their deities. They had statues of frogs. And this one, Heket, the goddess of birth, and you see the face there was one of a frog, and so that was one of their fertility gods. And then God sent the gnats, and between each one of these plagues, Moses would go in there and say, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh would say, "Nope, not happening." So then they brought in this plague of gnats, and that was an affront to Set, who is the god of the desert. And then they brought in a plague of flies, and just terrible. Walking on everything, and they're just nasty again. And that was from the god. Okay, somebody else pronounced that one. Uatchet, I don't know. But anyway, that was another one of their gods. And then there was a death of the cattle out there in Egypt. And what I got to remind everyone that all of these things that happened, everything that happened, it only happened to the Egyptians. It didn't happen to the Hebrews in the land of Goshen. It was just like all the plagues. They couldn't cross the border into Goshen where the Hebrews were. So again, another one of their gods were the cattle, Hathor, and then plague of boils, and that goes back to, I believe, to Sekhmet, the goddess of health. So that they had a deity for just about every aspect of their lives. Kind of even that was common back in those days, and even later on. Paul the apostle was walking through a city, and he looked around and he saw. I think it was Ephesus. He looked around and he saw temple after temple after temple, all for different gods and goddesses and deities and everything. Then he even came up with one. He saw one of them that says the temple to the unknown God, so that in case that they missed any, well, they could. That was their catch-all. God. So, these people had some kind of a deity for just about every aspect of their life. They had hail and fire was a plague. And again, that was against Nut, the goddess of the sky, which was supposed to, again, be a protection of them. And then locusts came in and destroyed their crops, ate up everything that was green. And that was an affront to Osiris, god of grain and underworld. And then the plague of darkness. Of course, that goes against their main god, which was Ra, the sun god. And I just have no idea how it worked out that they could have darkness in Egypt. And it says that for 3 days, people didn't leave their homes because it was so dark they couldn't see their hand in front of their face. And even when they tried to light a candle, it was so dark that they couldn't see it. They couldn't see anything. And I know that there's actually an aspect to that I can relate to, and I've told this story before about working down inside the columns of some of these large drilling rigs. That the columns, the posts that help these things float are sometimes, it depends, 24 to 32, 38, 40 feet in diameter. Huge metal columns. And back in the old days, they would coat these things with what they called a coal tar epoxy. And it was just so black and dark that when you would go in there with your flashlight and turn on the flashlight, it seemed like that the blackness and the darkness of these columns with that coal tar epoxy inside just swallowed up the light. And so that any other time, if they had light-colored paint on the inside, and more of the modern rigs years later on, 20, 30 years later, the rigs were painted with a different kind of, they had better technology for coatings, and so the paint, all the paint were paintings were not white, but they were a light pastel. It turned out to be kind of a greenish, light green color, but it was so much brighter. You could shine a flashlight in there, even though there may not be normal lights in there. You could shine your flashlight in there, and it would reflect rather than absorb all the light. So if you can just imagine being in a room where you could not see your hand in front of your face for 3 solid days. They said the people couldn't even go outside of their homes because they couldn't see where they were going, what they were doing. And that was showing that that God, the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was far superior to their false deities. And again, it was dark in Egypt, and it was light in Goshen. How did that happen? I don't know. It's a miracle. And so finally, we know the very last the last plague was what now we call, the Passover, and that's where God said He gave the Israelites a very specific formula for what they were to do. Now, this plague would have it was also visited on the land of Goshen too, because I think God was testing His people to see what they would do. If they were going to follow Him, if they were going to listen. And so He did, He gave them these instructions, and we know the story where they were supposed to take, God at first, He said, I want you to renumber your calendar. You're going to start the day now. Nisan will be your first month of the year. And so you're no longer going to be using this Egyptian calendar that they had. And in fact, let's see, Saturday was the first of Nisan, starting Friday night, but Saturday was the first of Nisan this year. And on the 10th of Nisan, they were supposed to select a lamb or a kid. They were supposed to get a goat or a sheep on the 10th day of Nisan and keep it there, make sure that it was unblemished. It was supposed to be under a year old, and then they would slaughter it on the 9th of the 14th. They would capture the blood in a basin and brush it with hyssop and spread the blood over the doorpost and the lintels. And let me see what kind of here's the requirements. All right. They would capture the blood in a basin and brush the hyssop on the doorpost and the lintel, and then they would roast the lamb, but they were supposed to eat it all up, no leftovers. If there was anything left over, they would burn it. Don't break any of the bones. They were to eat their meat with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And so there was, and it says to gird up your loins. In other words, fix your clothes. You know, they wore these robes and stuff. So he said, tie them up and get them ready so that you can leave quickly and do some hiking out of town so that you don't trip over your robes. And don't leave the house until the morning. So here's a picture of them applying the blood over the doorposts, and people have noted blood on the top and the sides are reminiscent of having, you know, like the blood on the cross from his crowned head crowned with the thorns. He was bleeding, and then his Yeshua's hands that were nailed to the cross. And also they would have slaughtered the lamb there at the sill of the door, and so that would have again signified his feet. And so that was that's what that would look like. And then of course here's a painting of the death angel going by.